Happy Friday, everyone. I am Andrew Seaman, your host for today's show. I am the senior news editor for GetHired and the senior news editor for job searches and careers at LinkedIn News. Thank you so much for joining us for a special edition of GetHired Live. Today, we're actually turning the tables and we're going to be talking with recruiters and talent professionals about incorporating diversity into their everyday work. So thank you for joining us. If this is your first time, please introduce yourself in the comments. Tell us a little bit about yourself, maybe where you work, what you focus on, if you have a specialized in recruiting, or maybe you're a job seeker and you want to listen in on the conversation. Tell us a little bit about yourself and, connect with each other. Networking is so important, no matter what stage of the job search you're in, or no matter what stage of your career you are in. So connect with each other, have a nice conversation in the comments, be kind, and we'll have a great show today. If anything sort of choppy happens with my technology, just bear with us. My colleague Steven will step on until I could get back online. Even in the heart of New York City, we are not immune from internet trouble. So just stick with us if I have any issues, but hopefully we won't, because we have a wonderful guest today. We have Jennifer Tardy, who is the founder and CEO of Jennifer Tardy Consulting. So let's bring her on the screen. So welcome, Jen.
Hello. Thank you for having me again, Andrew. I appreciate you.
Definitely. And thank you for joining us. So, we have so many people joining us in the stream. We have Elizabeth in Texas, Mary in Illinois, Bruce from California, Jas from Georgia, Les from North Carolina, Said in Lebanon, Tasha from Texas, Stefan in Sweden, Karina in Miami, and Elizabeth in Massachusetts. So we have so many people joining us from all over the world to talk about this. And before we go any further, I want to say thank you and congratulations. You are a 2020 LinkedIn Top Voice. So you are one of the most follows.
Uh-oh.
So, as Andrew was saying, that we are not immune from internet troubles.
Can I bring him back?
Oh, he's back.
Okay. And we're going to make it work.
So, okay.
I'm going to drive.
We are back. So, Jen, can you tell us a little bit about what you do and what your daily day-to-day is?
Absolutely. So one of the things about the world that I live in is that we actually talk to two different audiences. Within Jennifer Tardy Consulting, we spend a lot of time doing career coaching with people who are on their job search. And one of the particulars about what we do is we help people to navigate the bias that's within the hiring process. And then where I spend a lot of time as well, too, is that we work with employers who are working to create effective diversity recruiting programs. So working on both sides of the hiring process is fun and it's necessary. So it's one thing to teach tactics to people who are on their job search, but on the other end, there's a huge conversation around the actual hiring process and any of the barriers that are within that hiring process. Because if we don't start removing some of those barriers, we are not going to ever begin to increase diversity. And I know that that's what a lot of organizations do want to do.
So tell me about those conversations that used to happen. Tell me what the conversation was maybe 5 years ago and how that's changed over time.
Great question. So a lot of employers, and they'll still come to me today and they'll say, hey, Jen, what more can we do to increase diversity? Because our leaders are now making these public commitments that we are going to do X, Y, and Z to increase diversity within our organization. So what more can we do? And typically when they're asking that question, they mean, can you tell me about some additional job boards that we can post our positions on? Or can you teach me another unique Boolean search string results? But what I tend to share with employers is that it's not just about what you start doing, it's also about what you have to stop doing as well, too. And so I spend a lot of time helping employers to identify where bias hides in the hiring process overall. And one of the things that I share with people, and you've probably heard, anyone listening has probably heard me say this before, but the hiring process isn't broken. It's doing exactly what it was created to do centuries ago, which is it was created to ensure that that specific populations, for example, white men, were able to get to the most successful positions, the most coveted positions. Now, although there's been a lot of legislation that has been enacted and the needle has moved, and so there's not as much discrimination in the hiring process, there's still a lot that's still there that needs to be removed. And so our process is how do we find those things that are no longer overt, that are now more covert? How do we find those things that are no longer just straight up discrimination, but now it's more of the unconscious biases? And so that's when they bring me into the process. That's how things look different now. It's not just about what you have to start doing, it's also about what you have to stop doing.
So you kind of touched on this, but since it is a unconscious bias, some people might not be like, might not know that this is something that's happening in their workplace. So as a leader, as a hiring manager, how do I look at within, and how do I look at my company and say, hey, this is something that maybe I need help in, and I need to bring someone like Jen Tardy in?
Yeah, so one of the first things that that I recommend that organizations do is collect data. So there are companies that still do not collect data. And when I'm referring to data, I'm talking about candidate self-ID data, or giving candidates the ability to self-identify based on various demographics like race, ethnicity, gender, veteran status, things of that nature. And so then you have organizations that are collecting data, they're just not looking at the data. And so what I'm trying to move more organizations toward is not only collecting it, not only looking at it, but also doing something with it, process improving it. So let me just give an example. I've been working on contracts lately where we may see that at each milestone of the hiring process, and when I talk about milestones, it may be the recruiter, so a person applies to a position, which can be a milestone. The recruiter does the first round of screening. The recruiter does the phone screen. The hiring manager does the phone interview. Then they do the final interview, like different milestones like that. We begin looking from step to step, like one milestone to the next, and we'll say, okay, what's happening in the hiring process with candidates by way of how they identify. So we're able to slice and dice the data. And if we begin to see that there's a certain step in the process where people are falling out of the process, now we want to know why. So if we look at, are more people withdrawing at a certain step, or are more people actually being rejected at a certain step? Okay, then let's look at that. Why are they being rejected? Is it, and so that's how, the more we can kind of unfold these layers, the more we can get to the bottom of what exactly is going on.
That's great. So I want to say hello to some people that are joining us on the stream. We have Thiago in Brazil, Sandra from Virginia, Alyssa in Mexico, Ahmed in New York, Paul from New Jersey, Mohammed in Jordan, Dayan from New Mexico, Lisa from Florida, Janetta from South Carolina, and Deirdre from Texas. I hope you're doing okay down there. You are talking to us about the steps and looking into that data of where people might be falling out. So in your experience, is there a certain place where people do fall out, where people of color and minorities are not being seen?
Yes. And one of the places where I see it, there are two things that I actually want to talk about here. One is it's typically during the interview process, right? And so if we have hiring teams who are looking for someone very particular, someone in particular, they're going to keep sifting through people until they can actually find that person that they're looking for. So like the idea of finding, I know what I'm looking for and I'll see it when I find it, that's when it kind of pops up around the interview process. And so from the time that a person is selected to interview, and if they don't move past the interview, it's usually that time frame. Something else that I also want to point out too that we've seen within the hiring process as well is the number of resumes that go unreviewed by recruiters in particular. and what I mean by that is, if you're a recruiter, you're already living in this world and you understand it. And so typically we'll post a position. And when we post that position, we may leave it posted for about, I don't know, let's say two weeks, maybe 3 weeks. And within that time period, maybe within the first 7 days, recruiters will begin sifting through and moving the most competitive candidates along to the hiring manager. The hiring manager will say, yep, absolutely, I know who I want to interview. And so it's that first stack of people, in this example, that will continue to move through the hiring process, and then someone will get hired. But then you have all of these resumes that go unreviewed, which is a big issue. And having been a recruiter for so long, I fully understand why. We want to be able to send the first group of people through, and if that doesn't work out, then let's continue sifting through, everyone else and reviewing additional resumes. But when it doesn't happen, you still have people unreviewed. So here's what I recommend to recruiters. You don't necessarily have to leave a position posted for 2 weeks. So if you do leave it posted for 2 weeks in this example, then make sure that you've reviewed all of the resumes, or at least you've used the system, you've gone through, but every resume gets reviewed, right? Or the second piece that I would say is, if you get so many resumes that you can't review all those resumes, don't leave the position posted that long. Maybe leave it posted for a week while you're reviewing those resumes. And if you can't get the pool that you're looking for, then increase it for another week. Because it's in that pool also that we begin to see that there's a lot of diversity within this pool, but maybe they didn't apply in time, or they thought it was in time, but the recruiter had already moved on.
So Jen, we actually have Andrew back. So let's bring him in and see how he's looking. Andrew, hello.
Hi. Different angle.
Well, we can hear you, but you're a little frozen. But we can go with that. Jen was telling us about resumes and what recruiters can do to make sure that people are being seen.
Definitely.
So I'll let you take it from there.
Thanks so much, Stephen. And Jen, and if I'm sorry again if I drop out again, but Jen, we talked a little bit about when things companies should start doing when it comes to diversity, but what they should stop doing. So you talked about resumes. What else should they stop doing, do you think?
One of the biggest things, and I hope that there's a lot of recruiters listening to this, is when it's time to receive feedback about people who've been interviewed. What typically happens is the interview team, who's actually, they participated in the final interview, they will either not submit any feedback. Maybe they'll just go to the hiring manager and say, I give it a thumbs up, or I give it a thumbs down. Or if they do submit feedback, it may be irrelevant feedback, like, oh, I didn't really like, that Jen had locks in her hair. I don't really know if that's going to fly here. It's probably not going to happen. But or if they do submit feedback that's relevant, then they may not submit it in time, meaning the hiring manager has already made their own decision. And so it wouldn't even matter what the rest of the interview team said. And so what I encourage recruiting teams to mandate is that everyone who participates on the interview team, they must deliver meaningful feedback. One of the things that I teach within my diversity recruiting training program is we talk about what meaningful feedback looks like. And if the feedback that you get on someone being hired or someone being rejected, if it's not meaningful feedback, the recruiter has to lean in to ask more questions, and which is another big issue. Something else that we have to stop doing. We have to stop going to the extreme with this idea of recruiters needing to be so easy to do business with that it affects a recruiter's ability to lean in to disrupt things that that hiring teams need to stop. I know I'm rambling on, but I hope that makes sense.
No, it makes complete sense. And, we talked also a little bit before the show about addressing a person's internal resistance to having some of these conversations, because I assume, and especially there might be recruiters out there who say, listen, I don't feel comfortable pushing back on these issues? How do I start this conversation? I don't want to sound offensive. I don't want to sound ill-informed. So how should recruiters address their own internal issues to sort of open the gateway to say, hey, you can't just reject all these candidates, or you can't only, keep interviewing people who are white, male, and under 30. How do you sort of, how do you have those conversations? I assume sort of like that, but.
No, that's great. But I want to actually take a step back and just talk about resistance for a second, or at least resistance in context to being a recruiter. A lot of organizations will say, hey, I'm going to send my recruiter to training. And then the training that the recruiter goes to, it teaches you tactics. It teaches you, again, how to, new job boards to go and source, or how to talk to people and things like that. But what is so, what's missing, I was going to say what's frustrating to me, is that there's a prerequisite to really leaning all the way in and being a strong, high-performing recruiter when it comes to increasing diversity, and it's addressing resistance. One of the foundational things that needs to be taught to all recruiters is helping them to identify areas within them where they don't feel qualified, capable, or confident around the topic of diversity, right? And there are usually some telltale signs that I see when I go into organizations, that there's just a lot of discomfort, and maybe we need to start with, this whole idea of resistance, because recruiters, humans in general, it takes a lot of vulnerability to say, hey, I really don't feel comfortable. I don't know the right words to use, and I'm afraid that I'm going to offend somebody, and then the company is going to get sued. And then, these are thoughts that can actually happen. And so when we feel that way, we tend to lean out. So this idea of helping people to feel qualified, capable, and confident in doing that work, it has to be addressed first.
And who should they go to with that? Because,
well, let me answer what I think.
Having a diverse workspace is great because you have so many different ideas and different input. But asking, hey, listen, I'm uncomfortable about this, you should be going to your manager, right? This is a recruiter should go to them and say, hey, listen, we need training. We need someone to come in and talk to us about this, right?
I would actually say this in a very different way. Recruiting leaders, I want them to assume that everybody on their recruiting team needs support in addressing their own resistance. And so that way, you don't have to wait for a recruiter to raise their hand and say, hey, I need a little bit of help. I need a little bit of support. I think someone said it best inside of one of my classes. They said, hey, I've always known that there's been a little bit of resistance, but I never really took the time to identify what was blocking that natural flow for me, wanting to lean all the way into this work. And so through some of these exercises that we teach in the course, they're able to say, okay, this is my resistance, and now here's how we move beyond it. And I can go get educated, I can go get some training, some support, some help. So back to your question, I think we should assume that everybody needs that support just because we're human.
Got it. And we talked about what companies shouldn't be doing. What should they be doing? So what are most companies maybe ignoring that they really should be integrating into their daily routines and tasks to make sure that this is a commitment for them?
Yeah, so there are two things that I'd like to talk about. One, and I'll sound like a broken record, but what companies should be doing, specifically recruiting departments, is getting closer to your data. Not just metrics on, time to fill, or, how many positions got filled, but data on, what's happening within your actual candidate pool. So getting closer to the data and using the data to guide conversations. what was I going to say? The second thing. The second thing that companies need to do, yes, is if we as a company are talking about increasing diversity within our organization, we've got to have a vulnerable conversation about the level of diversity within our personal networks. I actually just wrote an article about this because I was inspired through another webinar that I did the other week with Fairy God Boss. But if an organization, LinkedIn talks, and I love this talk that the previous CEO did at LinkedIn about the network gap. And so if data shows that there is a network gap, and if there's also data that shows that there's this hidden job market, which means that a lot of positions don't even get advertised, and how most people are finding those positions are through people in their network. But if your employee base, for example, is 90% white, and in their personal networks, there are no people of color, no people with disabilities, no people who identify as LGBTQ+. If there's no diversity in their networks, therein lies the network gap. Therein lies the issue with also increasing diversity in your company. So I would actually have an enterprise-wide conversation about the importance of increasing diversity within your personal network.
I think it's really, really good advice. And, when it comes to, having those conversations and sort of knowing that there's are things that need to change, this isn't something that it should just be sparked one day necessarily. This should be an ongoing commitment, right? This should be something where companies are constantly sort of saying, what can we do better? What can we sort of work into our processes, right? So it's not just sort of like, let's have one training, everyone's good. This is something that requires continued investment, right?
Yes, it's something that needs to be made systematic. And one way to make it systematic is to encourage your employees. You know how the airports do, if you see something, say something. Like that needs to be, people within organizations need to feel empowered that if they see something, say something. Because even if our organization comes in, we're not going to catch every single thing. And even if we catch the bulk of things that should be processed, improved, it doesn't mean that new things won't come up just because, again, we're human overall. One other thing that I do want to add, just because I think it's really important, is this one question. As we begin to talk about initiatives to increase diversity, a really important question that employers can ask is my workplace ready for increased diversity? And it's really thinking about who does this workplace, my workplace, most benefit? Who does it benefit the least? And, because oftentimes organizations will do, like, for instance, employee engagement surveys, and they'll say, okay, overall, people feel pretty engaged and they're feeling happy working here. But what about when you kind of slice and dice that data? What are, for example, Black men in executive positions saying at your organization? How does this smaller population feel overall within your organization? So who does my organization most benefit? Who do I have to be to get access to the most coveted positions within this company? And it's not something that someone can say, oh, well, this is what it's supposed to be. No, it's literally looking at the data. Who's actually in those positions today? And how did they get in those positions? So that was a rabbit hole, but I still think it's important for organizations to think about that.
No, it definitely is, because I remember being at an organization, and we had the good fortune to have a manager who was Sri Lankan, and he showed up in the newsroom and basically said, no one else here looks like me, and that's a problem. And, he did the work, and he looked at, who was in the leadership positions. And really, he looked at the data, and we really, in a small amount of time, was able to sort of turn the ship around. And as I always tell people, when he did that, the workplace got better for everyone. Like, our work got better, people were happier. So like, he looked at who was in leadership, he looked how they got there. And so I think that's really really a great idea. And we have a bunch of questions coming in, and one I want to get to is, let's see, from Charisse. She wants to know how headhunters can be better allies in the job search for people. So if you're a recruiter, how do you help job seekers beyond your normal function, maybe?
So the best way, and let me even preface this by saying, headhunters are in a very tough position because this idea of being easy to do business with is even more prominent if the company is your client as well. But to answer that question, Andrew, one of the best ways that you can be supportive of job seekers is to still lean in to tough conversations with hiring managers that you see, that show in their behavior bias.
Got it. And we also have a question here from Noah. And Noah's basically asking, and it's really, really good, and I like how he framed it. When it comes to disability inclusion, how can we teach employers to get out of the mindset of compliance as being the goal, instead of them focusing on great user experiences for people with disabilities?
Yeah, so it's the exact same logic, right? The more you can tie whichever underrepresented population you're talking about, and in this example, we're talking about people with disabilities, but the more you can tie how increasing diversity among people with disabilities at our company can help the organization meet its goals, tying it to the bottom line, and not just the leaders understanding, but everyone in the company understanding it, that helps to move the dial in the conversation so that it's not just a compliance thing or even a good faith efforts type of thing. Organizations move fast when they see how doing something or not doing something affects their bottom line. And it's the reality. It's the reality.
Yeah. And another question we have is from Judy, and I think it's interesting because she basically says, she wants to know whether data is accurate in the hiring process because people are becoming less willing to disclose their data in the first place due to risk of being discriminated. So how do you create that diverse slate of people when maybe you worry whether or not you have the data to show that it's actually a representative group of people that you're putting up for a position?
Yeah. So the question, as I believe I heard it, was the challenge around job seekers feeling more cautious about voluntarily identifying themselves. I actually believe it's the opposite, that more of them are leaning into the conversation, not leaning into the conversation, they're leaning in to identify themselves as this whole idea of organizations wanting to increase diversity continues to be a subject of conversation. What organizations can do to continue helping people to feel comfortable with voluntarily identifying themselves in the application process is to have conversations about about how data is used, right? And so right now, if job seekers, to this example, are thinking that, oh, you're going to use this data just so you can kick me out of the process, but if there's a statement somewhere within your application process or on your career page where you're talking about your initiative to increase diversity, and one of the ways that you're ensuring that you have diverse candidate pools is because people are volunteering more their self-ID data. So just getting more people within the organization to get ahead of what those objections are that job seekers may have and putting those statements or those videos, those conversations out there beforehand, is going to encourage more people to volunteer that information.
Got it. And I'm going to use my prerogative as the host to ask the last question, which is, for people watching today who are in a recruiting, hiring, or talent position, what is the one thing walking away from this broadcast that you want them to do or take away? If there's sort of like that one piece that you say, when you go back to your, home office or whatever, start doing this. What do you want that to be?
I am a huge advocate of training in a safe space. So my recommendation would be to find a program that you believe is best fitting for your organization, and send not only your recruiters through it, specifically about diversity recruiting, that really goes levels deep, not just surface, but also sending your hiring teams through it as well too, so that they're able to have cross conversations about what they're learning. Invest in it. And let me just say one other thing, because I thought about it this morning. I see organizations donating and pledging millions of dollars to different organizations, especially around, the Black Lives Matter movement. They're like, I'm gonna give $1 million here or $1 million here. And then I'm thinking, but your recruiting team just said that it's like pulling teeth trying to get you to pay for them to go and get training. And I'm like, why can't there be a better balance of that? Teach your recruiters and your hiring leaders, and we wouldn't have all of these challenges that these external organizations have to build in order to help to disrupt those two. So training is really, really important.
I think that's such a great message. And actually, on Monday, my colleagues are going to have a show related to sort of economic disparities, usually caused by workplace issues. So it ties right into that. But Jen, hopefully everyone is watching the bottom of the screen, seeing your website being advertised and seeing your LinkedIn profile. And like I said, you're a top voice, so you are definitely worthy of their time and attention. You are wonderful. Thank you so much for bearing with us through all of this.
Absolutely. You all are wonderful. And I'm so excited that I've had a chance to have another conversation with you, Andrew. Andrew, I appreciate you.
And, I hope everyone is staying safe. And like I said, Monday, there's a great show my colleagues are going to be putting on. So be sure to watch on Monday. LinkedIn News Live will be on at noon, discussing how we can fix economic disparities that often begin in the workplace. Our host, Nina Melendez, will be joined by author and activist Dr. Ibram Kendi, to address racial inequalities in education, economics, and beyond. You won't want to miss that. And obviously, if you're paying attention over the summer, his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, was on all the bestseller list, and it's worthy of a read too. So be sure to tune in Monday. It's going to be a must-see event. And thank you for tuning in. And until we see again, best of luck and stay safe.